time is a river that sometimes flows backward. In August 1901, two English ladies learned this from their own experience when the misty alleys of Versailles became a portal to a vanished world. Miss Anne Moberly and Miss Eleanor Jourdain were educated women of the Victorian era, directors of an Oxford college, accustomed to logic and order. But in the gardens where the Sun King once ruled, logic proved powerless against a mystery that changed their lives forever. Versailles preserved the memory of its golden age, when minuets echoed in its halls, and ladies in silks and laces strolled along its pathways. But what happens when the past refuses to remain past? When the boundary between what was and what is dissolves like mist at dawn? The story you are about to hear challenges everything we know about the nature of time and memory. Close your eyes and imagine a cool August evening when the air is filled with the scent of wilting roses and damp earth after rain. Gray clouds hang low over the Versailles gardens, and silence envelops the ancient alleys like a soft blanket. Two figures in dark dresses slowly walk along the gravel paths, their footsteps muffled in the thick air. Around them slumber centuries-old oaks, and marble statues gaze into nothingness with empty eyes, keeping the secrets of long-gone eras. Somewhere in the distance, a barely distinguishable sound can be heard. Perhaps it is the rustle of leaves in the wind, or perhaps the echo of forgotten voices that still wander in these enchanted gardens, finding no peace. Mist spread over the Versailles alleys like a ghostly veil, hiding the secrets of the past from the eyes of the present. The 10th of August, 1801, turned out to be remarkably overcast for a summer day. Gray clouds hung low over the earth, and humid air permeated everything around with a special, almost tangible silence. France greeted the new century with solemn calm, and ancient Versailles dozed under the cover of time, keeping in its stones the memory of former glory. Along the gravel roads leading to the famous palace, two English ladies walked unhurriedly. Miss Anne Moberly, director of St. Hugh's College at Oxford, moved with the dignity inherent in a woman accustomed to responsibility and respect. Her companion, Miss Eleanor Jourdain, deputy director of the same educational institution, was somewhat younger and of more lively temperament, but her manners also reflected the upbringing and intelligence of the Victorian era. Both ladies were at that age when life experience has already been accumulated, but curiosity about the world has not yet faded. Anne Moberly, who had turned 55, had lived a life dedicated to education and sciences. The daughter of a bishop, she had been surrounded by books and scholarly conversations from childhood, which formed in her an inclination toward careful analysis and critical thinking. Eleanor Jourdain, 10 years younger, also came from an educated family, and from her youth had been fascinated by history and literature. Their friendship, which began within the walls of Oxford, was built on common interests and mutual respect. Both were unmarried women, which in those times meant a certain boldness and independence of character. They belonged to that generation of Victorian women who managed to find their place in the world of science and education, overcoming the prejudices of the era. They undertook their journey to France as a small rest before the beginning of the new academic year. Paris charmed them with its elegance and cultural richness, but Versailles beckoned especially. This symbol of French monarchy, where history seemed frozen in ceremonial halls and shady alleys. They were educated women, well versed in French history, and therefore every corner of the palace and park spoke to them of long past events. On the morning of this August day, they toured the palace itself with its famous hall of mirrors, where sunlight, breaking through tall windows, played with countless reflections on mirror surfaces. Here once strolled Louis XIV, the Sun King. Here shone with her beauty Marie Antoinette. Here the fates of Europe were decided. Every room breathed history, and both Englishwomen felt this particularly keenly. After touring the palace, they decided to walk through the famous gardens created by the great Le Nôtre for the Sun King. These gardens were a masterpiece of landscape art. Geometrically correct parterres, wide alleys decorated with statues, fountains whose jets rose to the sky like liquid columns. But on this day, many fountains were silent, and the mist gave the entire landscape a certain unreality. Miss Moberly stopped at the balustrade, from where a view opened onto the Grand Canal. This water artery of the Versailles Park, stretching more than a mile. The water in the canal was dark and motionless, reflecting the gray sky like an ancient mirror. The air smelled of damp earth and withering leaves, though August had not yet ended. Something in this atmosphere was unusual. Both women sensed this, though they could not precisely define what it was. The silence was too deep for a tourist place, even on an overcast day. It seemed that the air itself had become denser, and sounds came as if from afar, muffled by an invisible curtain. Miss Jourdain adjusted her hat and looked at the map they had taken at the entrance. Their destination was the Petit Trianon, a small palace built for Madame de Pompadour, and later became the favorite refuge of the unfortunate Marie Antoinette. This corner of Versailles promised a more intimate atmosphere compared to the ceremonial halls of the main palace. The road to Trianon led through the English Park, a part of the gardens designed in a more natural style, unlike the strict geometry of the main parterres. Here, trees grew more freely, and paths wound between groves and clearings. It was precisely this contrast between the strict French and picturesque English styles that made the Versailles gardens so diverse and charming. As they delved deeper into the park, the mist seemed to become even denser. The outlines of trees became blurred, and distant statues turned into ghostly silhouettes. Miss Moberly noticed that the birds had fallen silent. Even the usual chirping of sparrows and the trills of other feathered inhabitants of the park had quieted, as if nature held its breath in anticipation of something unusual. Imagine this feeling when the familiar world suddenly becomes alien, when familiar sounds disappear, and the air fills with a premonition of mystery. It was precisely this feeling that overcame the two English ladies as they walked along the misty alleys of Versailles on that memorable August day. They did not know that in a few minutes their lives would change forever, that they would become witnesses to an event that would challenge all their ideas about time and reality. They were walking toward one of the most mysterious stories of the 20th century, which began right here among the ghostly shadows of the Versailles Park, shrouded in mist and silence. The path along which Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain walked wound between old oaks and linden trees, whose crowns disappeared into the gray mist. The gravel under their feet crunched in a muffled way as if the sound itself lost its sharpness in this strange atmosphere. The air became denser, filling with aromas that were difficult to identify. Perhaps it was the scent of old roses, or something more subtle and elusive, as if memory itself of the past had its own special fragrance. Eleanor was the first to notice that something had changed. She stopped in the middle of the alley and looked around, trying to understand what exactly caused this strange anxiety in her. The trees around seemed to be the same, but their silhouettes somehow became clearer despite the mist. The foliage rustled without wind, creating a barely audible melody that resembled distant whispers in an unfamiliar language. Anne also felt the change. Being a practical and rational woman, she tried to find a logical explanation for her sensations. Perhaps it was simply fatigue after a long walk, or the influence of the unfamiliar French climate. But deep in her soul, she understood that something unusual was happening, something that could not be simply explained. The light around them became somehow special. Although the sun still hid behind clouds, the lighting acquired a golden tint, as if the entire world was bathed in the honey radiance of a setting sun. Shadows became longer and softer, and the outlines of objects more blurred and at the same time more expressive, as in ancient paintings. They passed a small grove and emerged into an open space where several paths diverged in different directions. Here stood an ancient bench of stone, darkened with time, covered with a light coating of moss. Next to it grew bushes that at another time of year were probably covered with flowers, but now looked somewhat neglected. Miss Jourdain took out the map and tried to orient herself, but the letters on the paper seemed to float before her eyes, becoming unclear. She cleaned her glasses and tried again, but the result was the same. The map, which had been perfectly clear an hour ago, now seemed written in some ancient language. Around them began to appear sounds that had not been there before. At first, it was a barely audible creaking, as if the wheels of an old carriage were turning somewhere in the distance. Then voices were heard, not modern French speech, but something more archaic, with special intonations and pronunciation that both Englishwomen had heard only in theatrical productions of historical plays. The mist began to dissipate, but not as it usually happens in nature. It retreated in patches, revealing space like a theatrical curtain. And what was revealed to their sight made both women freeze in amazement. The gardens around them had transformed. The same trees and paths remained in place, but everything looked different, brighter, more alive, as if someone had wiped the dust of centuries from the world. The lawns were trimmed with mathematical precision. Flower beds bloomed with the freshness of recent planting, and statues that had recently seemed darkened with time now shone with the whiteness of marble. The air filled with new aromas, the scent of freshly cut grass, rose oil, the subtle fragrance of jasmine, and something else indefinite, but wonderfully pleasant. This was the scent of luxury, refinement, that special air breathed at the courts of European monarchs. The sounds also changed. Now they heard not only the creaking of wheels, but also the clatter of hooves on stone pavement, laughter, and conversations of people, the sound of streaming water from fountains that had been silent just a minute ago. Somewhere in the distance, music played, elegant melodies of the harpsichord, intertwining with gentle sounds of the flute. Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain stood as if enchanted, unable to believe their own eyes. Their educated minds refused to accept what was happening, but all their senses testified to one thing. They had somehow incredibly been transported to the past, to an era when Versailles was the living, breathing heart of French monarchy. Eleanor was the first to come to her senses. She carefully stepped forward, as if afraid that one careless movement would destroy this vision. The gravel under her feet crunched as before, but now this sound was clear and distinct, without that muffled quality that had accompanied their walk until this moment. Anne followed her friend, and they slowly walked through the transformed park. Each step revealed new wonders to them. Now they saw a gardener in ancient clothing, bent over a bed of roses. Now bright fabric of a woman's dress flashed around a turn in the alley. All this was so real that it was impossible to consider what was happening a game of imagination. The sun broke through the clouds, and the entire park was flooded with golden light. In this light, the world of the 18th century appeared before them in all its beauty, well-maintained, luxurious, full of life and movement. This was Versailles in the era of its flourishing, when every bush was trimmed by the king's will, and every path led to a new wonder of landscape art. Along the wide alley leading to the palace, a carriage slowly passed, drawn by a pair of bay horses. The coachman in livery bowed to the passing ladies, and in this bow was such naturalness that both Englishwomen automatically responded to the greeting. Only after this did they realize that the coachman had seen them, meaning they truly were part of this world, not merely observers of it. Their hearts beat rapidly, and their throats were dry with excitement. They were walking through 18th century Versailles, breathing its air, hearing its sounds, and feeling its aromas. This was impossible, illogical, contradicted all laws of nature, but it was happening to them in reality. Ahead appeared a small pavilion surrounded by blooming bushes. From there came sounds of conversation and quiet laughter. Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain exchanged glances, and as if obeying one impulse, headed there, not knowing that in a few minutes they would see a figure who would enter history as one of the most tragic women of France. They encountered people in period costumes more and more often. Here passed a group of court ladies in magnificent dresses with bustles, their faces powdered and hair arranged in high coiffures, decorated with ribbons and flowers. Men wore wigs, embroidered waistcoats, and silk stockings. All of them moved with a special grace inherent to people who had been raised at court from childhood. None of these people paid special attention to the Englishwomen, as if their presence here was completely natural. Occasionally, someone would nod to them or smile, but generally, they felt not like guests, but like part of this world. The air became increasingly saturated with aromas. To the scents of flowers and herbs were added notes of expensive perfumes, powder, pomade. This was a symphony of scents of the 18th century, when perfumery was considered a high art, and every aristocrat had their own special fragrance. The sounds also became richer and more diverse. To the music of the harpsichord were added string instruments, creating an exquisite melody that seemed to dissolve in the air and become part of the very atmosphere of the park. People's voices sounded melodious, with those special intonations of Old French that contemporaries had already lost. Miss Jourdain noticed that her own clothing had somehow become less noticeable against the background of surrounding luxury. Not that it had changed physically, but as if the very atmosphere of the era made modern costume less contrasting, more suitable to the general style. They were approaching the place where their meeting with history, in the most direct sense, awaited them. Each step brought new discoveries. Each turn of the path opened a new page from the life of Versailles in the era of its greatness. And although both women had not yet fully realized what was happening to them, they already felt that they had become witnesses to something completely exceptional. In a small gazebo, surrounded by rose bushes, sat a woman in a white dress. She was alone, and deep sadness could be read in her posture. Her head was bowed, and her hands were folded on her knees in a gesture of submission to fate. Around her floated an atmosphere of melancholy that seemed almost tangible. Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain stopped at a respectful distance, not wanting to disturb the stranger's solitude. But something in her appearance seemed familiar to them. Perhaps they had seen a similar portrait in one of the palace galleries, or these facial features reminded them of someone from historical figures whose images they had encountered in books. The woman raised her head and looked in their direction. Her face was pale, but still retained traces of former beauty. In her eyes could be read fatigue, but not physical, but spiritual. The fatigue of a person who had experienced too many trials. She was young, but looked older than her years, as if grief had left its indelible mark on her. She wore a simple white dress, without those decorations and jewels that other court ladies wore. Her hair was gathered simply, almost modestly, which contrasted with the elaborate hairstyles of the era. In this simplicity could be felt something tragic, as if the magnificence of the past remained behind, and ahead waited only trials. Her gaze was directed not at the Englishwomen, but somewhere into the distance, as if she saw something inaccessible to others. In this gaze was longing for lost happiness, and a premonition of trouble, and a strange submission to fate that struck with its depth. Miss Jourdain felt her heart compress with incomprehensible compassion for this unknown woman. something in her appearance evoked acute pity, a desire to comfort, to help, although it was completely unclear what this help could consist of. Anne Moberly was also struck by the sight of the sad lady. Her educated mind tried to find an explanation for that feeling of recognition that had overcome her at the sight of the stranger. The facial features seemed familiar, but memory refused to suggest where exactly she could have seen this face. The air around the gazebo was filled with the aroma of roses, but this aroma seemed sad, as if the flowers themselves mourned together with the lonely woman. Even the singing of birds in this corner of the garden sounded muffled, as if nature, out of delicacy, did not want to disturb someone's grief. Time seemed to stop in this moment. Two Englishwomen from the 20th century stood in an 18th century garden and looked at a woman whose fate was closely connected with one of the most dramatic pages of French history. They did not yet know who she was, but already felt the sadness emanating from her, which seemed not personal, but historical. The sadness of an entire era that was approaching its tragic end. The sun began to set, painting the sky in gentle pink and golden tones. In this evening light, the woman's white dress seemed almost ghostly, and she herself, a figure from the distant past that had suddenly become present. 18th century Versailles lived around them with full life, but in this life already sounded the first notes of future tragedy. This era was doomed, although many of its contemporaries did not yet suspect this. In the palace, music still played, ladies still flirted with cavaliers, and the king still considered himself God's anointed. But time had already begun its inexorable countdown, and the sadness of the woman in the white dress was a harbinger of those storms that would soon descend upon France. Versailles of the 1780s was like a beautiful dream that was about to turn into a nightmare. The golden days of monarchy were coming to an end, although outwardly everything still seemed unshakable and eternal. In the parks, roses still bloomed. In the halls, minuets still sounded, but the air was already filled with premonitions of change. Marie Antoinette, although our travelers did not yet know that it was her they were seeing, was a living embodiment of this era at sunset. Once a carefree princess, she now bore upon herself the weight not only of personal misfortunes, but also responsibility for the fate of the monarchy. The people grumbled. The state's finances were in a deplorable condition, and the political situation became increasingly tense. But at this moment, in the silence of the Versailles garden, time seemed to slow its course. The aromas of roses mixed with the scent of evening coolness. Somewhere in the distance, music played, and the sun slowly descended behind the tree crowns, painting the world in golden tones. This was the beauty of a doomed world, the last beauty of the old regime. The queen, for this was indeed she, sat in her favorite corner of the park, where she could temporarily forget about court etiquette and simply be a woman. Here, among flowers and silence, she could allow herself the sadness that had to be hidden at court. Here she was not a symbol of monarchy, but simply a person who was tired of fighting fate. Her simple white dress was not a whim of fashion, but a kind of rebellion against court luxury, which had become burdensome to her. In this simplicity was something of the peasant attire that she sometimes wore when playing shepherdess in her mock village. But now this simplicity had a different meaning. It was a premonition of that time when all court luxury would prove not just unnecessary, but dangerous. Her gaze was directed to where the palace was hidden behind trees. That very palace that was a symbol of French greatness, but now was becoming a golden cage. Each day brought new anxieties. Each night was full of restless dreams. The future seemed foggy and frightening. But still, music played. Still roses bloomed. Still the sun gilded the alleys of Versailles. Still one could sit in the silence of the garden and indulge in sad reflections on the vicissitudes of fate. The time of revolution had not yet come, although its breath was already felt in the air. Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain stood and watched this scene, not yet understanding fully that they were seeing the last days of an entire era, captured in one tragic image. The woman in the white dress was not just a random passerby. She was the embodiment of a historical moment when the old world still existed, but already carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Revolutionary ideas already floated in the air of Paris. The financial crisis deepened with each day. Popular discontent grew. But Versailles still lived its special life, where time flowed by different laws, where each day was like a theatrical performance played according to strict rules of etiquette. The Queen knew about the danger more than many thought. In her correspondence with her brother, the Austrian Emperor, notes of alarm already sounded. She understood that the position of the monarchy was becoming increasingly shaky, but could not find a way to correct the situation. Each of her attempts to help her husband in governing the state caused new attacks and accusations. The people saw in her a foreigner who spent state money on her whims, not understanding that behind external luxury hid deep loneliness and despair. She was blamed for all of France's troubles, made a scapegoat for the mistakes of many generations of kings. Antoinette became a symbol of everything the people hated in the old regime. But on this quiet evening, surrounded by blooming roses, she was simply a woman who was tired of struggle and had a premonition of approaching catastrophe. In her posture could be read not the pride of a queen, but the submission of a person who had accepted their fate. This was the beginning of that inner journey that would lead her from a frivolous princess to a tragic figure of history. The air filled with evening coolness, and the aromas of the garden became more intense. Roses gave off their fragrance with special force, as if hurrying to give the world all their beauty while there was time. Even the flowers seemed to sense the approach of changes that would alter not only human fates, but also the appearance of Versailles itself. Suddenly, the world around Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain began to change. This did not happen gradually, like the change of day and night, but sharply, as if someone had pulled an invisible curtain of time. The golden light of the setting sun dimmed. The sounds of the 18th century began to fade, like a radio being slowly turned off. The aromas of roses and expensive perfumes dissolved in the air, giving way to the familiar scent of modernity. Mist began to thicken again, but now it did not reveal the secrets of the past, but hid them. The contours of trees became blurred, statues darkened with time, and well-maintained lawns returned to their usual appearance. Fountains fell silent. The music of the harpsichord melted in the air and that same deep silence that had met them at the beginning of their walk set in. Both women stood in the same place where a minute ago they had seen the gazebo with the sad lady in white dress. But now before them was only a half-ruined stone bench and overgrown with ivy. The place where they had seen courtiers in magnificent costumes was deserted. The paths along which carriages had traveled were covered with the same gravel, but now it seemed old and worn. Miss Jourdain was the first to break the deafening silence. Her voice trembled with excitement and bewilderment. She tried to find words to describe what had just happened, but her tongue refused to obey. How can one explain the inexplicable? How can one convey an experience that contradicts all laws of nature? Anne Moberly remained silent, trying to comprehend what they had experienced. Her rational mind refused to accept what all her senses had witnessed. She was a scholar, accustomed to logical analysis. But what to do when logic is powerless before facts? They had indeed seen 18th century Versailles, heard the sounds of that era, felt its aromas. The map in Miss Jourdain's hands became readable again. The letters no longer floated before her eyes, and she could easily determine their location. They were exactly where they should have been, according to the route to the Petit Trianon. But how to explain that an hour ago this same map had been incomprehensible? Gradually, awareness of 20th century reality began to return to them. They heard distant voices of other tourists, saw modern signs, and felt that special air of a museum that differs from the air of a living place. Versailles had again become a monument to history, not a living decoration of court life. Both women walked on in silence, each immersed in her own thoughts. What had they experienced? A hallucination? A collective vision? Or had something truly impossible from the point of view of modern science really occurred? Their educated minds sought a rational explanation, but found none. They reached the Petit Trianon, that very palace that had been the goal of their walk. But now it seemed to them an ordinary museum exhibit, deprived of that magical aura that had surrounded everything during their strange journey. The rooms were empty. Period furniture stood behind glass, and portraits of long-dead people hung on the walls. In one of the halls, they saw a portrait of Marie Antoinette by Vigée Lebrun, the woman in the portrait was young and carefree, dressed in a magnificent blue dress, decorated with jewels. But Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain discovered with surprise that this cheerful beauty bore little resemblance to the sad lady in white dress they had seen in the garden. Returning to their hotel in Paris, they barely spoke. Each was occupied with attempts to comprehend what had happened. Words seemed inappropriate for describing the experience they had received. How to explain to other people what they themselves did not yet understand. In their rooms, they spent a restless night. Sleep came in snatches, and even in sleep, they were pursued by images of that amazing day. They saw faces of courtiers, heard sounds of the harpsichord, felt the aroma of roses. In the morning, both woke with a firm conviction that they had experienced something completely real, not a figment of imagination. At breakfast, they finally decided to talk about what had happened. It turned out that their memories coincided in the smallest details. They had seen the same people, heard the same sounds, felt the same smells. This could not be a simple coincidence or play of imagination. Miss Jourdain suggested recording everything they remembered while the memories were still fresh. They spent several hours reconstructing every detail of their adventure, every face, every sound. The more they remembered, the more convinced they became of the reality of what they had experienced. Their return to England brought them no peace. On the contrary, in the familiar surroundings of Oxford, their French adventure seemed even more incredible. Colleagues treated their story with polite skepticism, which only strengthened their desire to find some explanation for what had occurred. Miss Moberly began studying the history of Versailles with new passion. She reread the memoirs of courtiers, examined old plans of the palace and gardens, studied portraits and descriptions of costumes of that era. Every detail found confirmed the accuracy of their memories. They discovered that many details they had seen really existed in the 18th century, but had disappeared long before their birth. The bridge, they remembered, had been demolished in the 1870s. The house near which the sad lady sat had been destroyed during the Revolution. But the most striking discovery was that the woman in white dress could indeed be Marie Antoinette, but not as she was depicted in formal portraits. In the last years before the Revolution, the Queen really preferred simple white dresses to court luxury, and contemporaries noted her sadness and premonition of trouble. 10 years later, in 1911, they decided to publish their story. The book, titled An Adventure, caused a real sensation. Some considered their account fiction or self-deception. Others saw in it proof of the existence of paranormal phenomena. Critics pointed to contradictions in their descriptions, to the impossibility of what had occurred from the point of view of physics. But supporters emphasized the accuracy of historical details that two educated women, not specializing in French history, could not have known without special study. The debates continued for years. Psychologists offered theories about collective hallucination. Physicists discussed the possibility of time distortion. Historians checked every detail of their account, but no definitive explanation was ever found. The Society for Psychical Research became interested in their case. Experts questioned the ladies, analyzed their story, tried to find contradictions or signs of deception in it. But the more they studied this case, the more mysterious it became. Skeptics supposed that the women could have seen a historical reenactment or theatrical performance, but no records of such events at Versailles in 1901 were found. Moreover, the details of costumes and setting were too accurate for an amateur performance. Other critics offered the theory that the ladies had studied history in advance, and under the influence of the atmosphere of the place, had created a vivid picture of the past in their imagination. But against this theory spoke the fact that many details they described were not widely known and were contained only in archival documents. Francis Leyland, a well-known researcher of anomalous phenomena, conducted his own investigation. He visited Versailles, studied plans of gardens from different eras, analyzed witness testimonies. His conclusion was cautious but intriguing. The case cannot be explained by modern science, but also cannot be rejected as fiction. Years passed, and interest in the ghosts of Versailles did not fade. New generations of researchers repeatedly turned to this story, offering new theories and explanations. The development of quantum physics gave birth to hypotheses about parallel temporal flows. Psychology offered concepts of the collective unconscious. Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain themselves insisted on the truthfulness of their account until the end of their lives. They never changed a single detail, never added new particulars for greater credibility. Their story remained unchanged over decades, which spoke either of exceptional consistency in deception or of the authenticity of their experience. Anne Moberly died in 1937, never living to see a scientific explanation of her adventure. Eleanor Jourdain passed away in 1944. Until their last days, they maintained correspondence with researchers of anomalous phenomena and answered questions from skeptics. Their story became a classic case in parapsychology, studied in universities as an example of an unexplained phenomenon. Versailles became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in anomalous phenomena. Many tried to repeat their experience, but no one succeeded in experiencing anything similar. Modern researchers use the latest technologies to study Versailles. They measure electromagnetic fields, analyze acoustic anomalies, conduct psychological experiments, but the mystery of that August day in 1901 remains unsolved. Perhaps this is where the true value of their story lies. In a world where science explains almost everything, there remains a place for mystery, for miracle, for that which goes beyond ordinary understanding. The story of the two Englishwomen reminds us that reality may be much more complex and amazing than we think. Versailles keeps many secrets in its walls and gardens. Here kings lived and died. Here empires were born and perished. Here the history of Europe was made. Perhaps such places are indeed capable of preserving imprints of the past that under certain conditions become visible to living people. After all, time is one of the most mysterious forces in the universe. We measure it, use it, plan our lives in accordance with its flow, but still do not understand its nature completely. Perhaps in Versailles, this place where history reached its apogee, time flows according to special laws. The ancient stones of the palace remember the footsteps of kings. Mirrors in galleries reflected faces of long-dead beauties, and gardens heard declarations of love and political conspiracies. All this memory cannot simply disappear without a trace. It remains in the very air of the place, in its atmosphere, in subtle vibrations that science has not yet learned to detect. Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain perhaps found themselves at the right time in the right place. when the veil between past and present became thinner than usual. Their education and sensitivity allowed them to perceive what remains hidden from most. They became witnesses to one of the most amazing phenomena in human history. Their story continues to live, inspiring new generations of researchers, writers, dreamers. It reminds us that the world is full of wonders that await their hour to reveal themselves to those who are ready to see them. And perhaps someday science will find an explanation for what happened on that misty August day in the gardens of Versailles. Until then, the story of the two English ladies remains one of the most beautiful and mysterious secrets of the past century, a reminder that reality may be much richer than our ideas about it. In a world where everything seems studied and explained, such stories give hope that miracles are still possible, that mystery has not disappeared from our lives completely. Versailles still receives thousands of visitors every day. Tourists photograph themselves against mirrors, admire gardens, study the history of French monarchy. But only a few know about that amazing day when two Englishwomen saw this palace as it was in the days of its greatness, when past and present met in one moment of time. And who knows, perhaps somewhere in the misty alleys of the Versailles Park, 18th century music still sounds, and the sad lady in white dress still sits among roses, waiting for someone who can see her through the veil of time. For some moments of history are too beautiful and tragic to disappear forever. They remain to live in the memory of the place, in its soul, in those invisible dimensions that science is only beginning to comprehend.